The Victim Who Stayed Silent Alive. A Miss Marple Mystery. Section 1. The Bell That Rang Too Softly. A warm welcome, dear listener. Settle in, if you will, with a cup of something quiet, and let the lanes of St. Mary Mead once more open beneath your feet. Tonight our tale is of a woman who did not die when the village believed she had, and of the terrible patience it takes to be a corpse before one's time. It is called The Victim Who Stayed Silent Alive. The 1st of June came to St. Mary Mead the way the 1st of June had always come, slowly, with a great deal of fuss over the roses at the vicarage, and a certain rivalry between Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell over which of them had heard the cuckoo first. The lanes smelled of cut hay and warmed stone, and the shadow of St. Mary's steeple lay across the green like a long thin finger pointing gently at nothing in particular. It was the kind of morning that persuaded even sceptical persons that the world might be on balance a decent place. Miss Jane Marple, in the garden of her small cottage, was at that moment tying up a stem of delphinium that had a habit of leaning, as she said, towards indiscretion. Her fingers moved with the practised tenderness of one who had for many years persuaded reluctant plants and reluctant human beings into more becoming attitudes. Her hair, quite white now, was pinned beneath a shady straw, and her pale eyes, which so often deceived strangers by their mildness, were fixed thoughtfully on the church tower, from which the 8 o'clock bell had just spoken. It had rung, she noticed, a little too softly. Not late, not wrong. Simply softer than usual, as though the ringer had for one uncertain instant permitted his hand to shake before recovering. To most of the parish, such a thing would not have registered at all, but Miss Marple had lived within earshot of that bell for a great many decades, and she knew its temperament as she knew the temperaments of her nephews. A bell, she had long observed, could be as revealing as a face, and the face of St. Mary's this morning was a face that had heard something in the night. She had scarcely finished this reflection when the garden gate clicked, and Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, still incorrigibly young for her position, came hurrying up the path with the pink flush of news upon her cheeks. "Jane," said Griselda breathlessly, "the most awful thing. Eleanor Westcott is dead." Miss Marple lowered her scissors. "Dear me," she said softly, "how very sudden. Sudden and dreadful. Mrs. Bantry telephoned the vicarage not 10 minutes ago. Poor Eleanor was found this morning by her companion, Miss Prynne, in her own drawing-room. The doctor says it looks like heart, but you know how doctors are when they don't yet wish to alarm anybody. Len has gone up to the Grange." "Miss Prynne found her?" said Miss Marple, folding her secateurs into their leather sheath with unhurried care. "Yes, at 7, I think. Eleanor had risen early to write letters. She often did. Poor lamb. She couldn't bear a long morning in bed, and Miss Prynne came down, and there she was, in the wing chair by the window, quite still, with her letters on her lap and the pen fallen at her feet." "The pen fallen at her feet," Miss Marple repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "Dear, dear. And the window, was it open?" Griselda blinked. I really don't know, Jane. Would that matter?" "It might matter very little, dear, or a great deal. It so often depends." Something in the mild reply appeared to sober Griselda, for she sat down on the wooden bench and looked at her friend with a slower, more attentive gaze. It was a look that many people had learnt to give Miss Marple, and had learnt always a little too late. Eleanor Westcott had been for 12 years the mistress of Fernhollow Grange, a plum-coloured brick house that stood at the end of the village where the lane bent towards the woods. She was a widow of moderate means and immoderate correspondence. She wrote to distant cousins, to old-school friends, to organisations she had heard of only vaguely, and improved with her advice. She was 58, upright, kindly in the abstract and severe in the particular, and she had the reputation, cultivated over many years of small charities and larger opinions, of being, as Colonel Bantry put it, a thoroughly decent woman, if one liked that sort of decency. She had a niece, Alice Westcott, a fair, quick-tongued young woman of 26, who had come to live at the Grange after her father's death, and had stayed on with a mixture of gratitude and irritation that the village had long enjoyed dissecting. She had a companion, the aforementioned Miss Prynne, a spare, colourless person of about 40, who had been engaged 3 years earlier from an agency in Bath, and who had, so far as anyone could tell, no history worth mentioning, and no future she was in any hurry to arrange. And she had, more recently, a gentleman caller, Mr. Harold Ainsworth, a solicitor from Market Basing, who came out to Fernhollow twice a week ostensibly on matters of investment, and who had lately been observed, by more than one alert observer, walking with Mrs. Westcott under the lime trees in a manner that suggested his investments were of a personal kind. All of this Miss Marple already knew, in the effortless way that she knew everything about everybody within a mile of her front gate. She turned the information over in her mind as Griselda talked on, matching each figure against its private counterpart in her long inner catalogue of human types, Alice being not unlike the housemaid at Old Hall who had taken so unaccountably to poisoning the parrot, Miss Prynne recalling in some indefinable way Miss Trotter who had lived so quietly for 11 years and then astonished everyone, Mr. Ainsworth resembling nothing so much as the auctioneer at Much Benham who had married 3 widows in succession, all of them happy, all of them briefly. Len says Inspector Slack has been sent for from Much Benham, Griselda concluded. Ah, said Miss Marple gently. Then somebody at least does not believe it was the heart. They walked together up the lane. The village was already stirring, Mrs. Hartnell in her doorway with a duster held forgotten in one hand, the postman lingering by the pillar box in a way that suggested his sack was almost as full of news as of letters, 2 boys on bicycles balancing between the hedges and each other's elbows. From every window, invisible faces watched. St. Mary Mead had reacted to sudden death before, and knew its part. At the gates of Fern Hollow they were met by Dr. Haydock, who was coming down the drive with the abstracted face he wore when he was thinking one thing and preparing to say another. He greeted Miss Marple with the affectionate weariness of an old friend. "Well, Jane," he said, "I suppose you'd better come in. Slack has been and gone and been again. He wants everybody in the drawing-room in an hour." "Was it her heart, Doctor?" Griselda asked. Haydock hesitated. "Officially, for the moment, yes. Unofficially, I should like to know rather more about the small brown bottle on the writing table before I sign anything. Eleanor Westcott's heart was no worse than yours or mine, Mrs. Clement. But I'm an old man and I've been wrong before." "You have not, so far as I remember, been often wrong," said Miss Marple. Haydock smiled, tiredly. "You always were unnerving, Jane." Inside the hall of Fern Hollow the shadows lay cool upon the flagstones, and a bowl of white roses on the console table had begun to shed its petals in a soft, private way, one at a time, upon the polished wood. From the drawing-room door came the sound of a woman crying, controlled, decorous, unmistakably rehearsed to be overheard. Miss Marple paused at the threshold and looked once, without seeming to look, at everything. At the fallen petals, at the tall clock that had stopped at 10 minutes past 4, at the umbrella stand where a man's stick, a stranger's stick, leaned negligently among the household's own, and, most attentively of all, at the small brown bottle which stood, unstoppered, on the writing table beside a half-written letter in a firm, angular hand. The letter, she saw, began, "My dear Alice, there is something I must tell you before it is too late." The pen lay where it had fallen, at the foot of the wing chair. The chair itself was empty now. Eleanor Westcott had been carried upstairs, but a faint indentation remained in the cushion, and upon the arm of the chair, dry and almost invisible, was a single dark smear that Dr. Haydock had already, Miss Marple perceived, decided not to mention to Inspector Slack until he had spoken to her. The church bell rang the quarter. This time it rang firmly, as though whoever pulled the rope had had time now to steady his hand. Miss Marple folded her gloves neatly and laid them on the hall table. "It is a very great pity," she remarked, to nobody in particular, "when a letter is interrupted just as it becomes interesting." Section 2. The Village at its Windows. Miss Marple's remark about the interrupted letter fell into the hall of Fern Hollow Grange like a small pebble into a very still pond, and, as with such pebbles, its ripples went farther than the eye could follow. Dr. Haydock heard it, and his tired mouth tightened. Griselda heard it, and looked from Miss Marple to the writing table as though the sheet of paper had somehow acquired a new and disagreeable dimension. From behind the drawing-room door the sound of decorous weeping went on unchecked, and above their heads, on the landing, a floorboard creaked, once, then a second time, as though a person there had wished to come down and had thought better of it. "Come, Jane," said Griselda softly. "Let us go through." Miss Marple did not move at once. Her mild eyes travelled from the fallen petals of the white roses to the stopped clock at 10 minutes past 4, to the stranger's stick in the umbrella stand, and then, with the smallest inclination of her head, she permitted herself to be led. But she paused at the writing table long enough to observe, without appearing to observe, that the ink of the interrupted sentence was quite dry, and that the little brown bottle was labelled, in a chemist's tidy hand, "Digitalis Tincture, Mrs. Westcott, 1 drop as required." 1 drop, she thought, and the bottle unstoppered. Well, well. The drawing-room at Fern Hollow was a long, pleasant room, papered in a faded rose stripe, with tall windows opening upon the lawn. In one of the deep chairs by the empty grate sat Alice Westcott, her fair hair loose about her shoulders, a handkerchief pressed to a face which had, Miss Marple thought, been arranged for grief rather more carefully than grief usually arranges itself. On the window seat, upright, colourless and dry-eyed, sat Miss Prynne, the companion, her hands folded in her lap as though she were awaiting the second half of a service she did not particularly enjoy, and in the middle of the carpet, one thumb hooked into a waistcoat pocket and the other hand toying with his watch chain, stood Inspector Slack of Much Benham, looking, as usual, as though the entire village had been arranged for his personal inconvenience. "Ah, Miss Marple," said the inspector, in the voice of a man who has met an obstacle before and does not intend to be delayed by it a second time. "I hardly expected, but of course Mrs. Clement. Come in, come in. We are having, as I was saying, a quiet talk." "Please do not let us interrupt," said Miss Marple. "I shall sit here quite out of the way." She settled herself in a small hard chair near the door, from which she could observe the room without herself being much observed. A position Dr. Haydock reflected as he took up his own station by the mantelpiece, from which she had made her most damaging deductions for the last 30 years. "As I was saying," said Slack, resuming, "the doctor is not yet prepared to certify the cause. That is a formality. There is no reason at present to suspect anything but anything but nature. Nevertheless, we have a routine. Miss Westcott, if you would kindly go over your movements once more, from the time you last saw your aunt yesterday evening." Alice lifted her damp face. I said good night to her at 10:30. She was writing letters. She always wrote late. I went upstairs, I read a little, I went to sleep. This morning at 7, Miss Prynne woke me and told me. Here she pressed the handkerchief to her mouth again, and Miss Marple observed, with quiet interest, that the young woman's shoulders shook exactly as they had shaken a minute before, in the same rhythm, as though a mechanism inside her had been wound to a particular tempo. "Quite so," said Slack, briskly. "And you, Miss Prynne?" "I retired at 10, said Miss Prynne. Her voice was flat even, as though she were reading a list of household expenditure. Mrs. Westcott was in the drawing-room, alone. I came down at 10 minutes to 7, went to open the shutters, and found her in the wing-chair. I did not touch her. I telephoned Dr. Haydock at once. "You did not call out," said the inspector. "There was nobody to call to. Miss Westcott sleeps at the far end of the house. The maid, Ellen, is deaf. It seemed to me more sensible to fetch help." "Very cool-headed of you," said Slack, who plainly considered coolness in a woman a form of guilt. "I have had cause to be cool-headed before," said Miss Prynne, and looked out of the window. Miss Marple's gaze rested on her for a long, mild moment. There is a kind of woman, she was reflecting, who has spent so many years being of no importance to anybody, that when at last a great matter comes to her she meets it as she meets the weather, without expression, without complaint, and without, alas, any evident surprise. Miss Prynne was such a woman, or wished, at any rate, to appear such a woman, which, Miss Marple thought, was not always precisely the same thing. By the time Slack had finished his round of preliminary questions and gone out to the writing table with Dr. Haydock, the news had spread across St. Mary Mead as fire spreads across dry stubble. In the post office Mrs. Hartnell was already explaining to Miss Weatherby that she had never trusted that solicitor person from Market Basing, and had said so, in fact, only last Wednesday, to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Price Ridley in her front parlour was telling the vicar's curate that the niece, that quick young woman with the eyes, had been heard to quarrel with her aunt on the very evening of the death, quarrel dreadfully, over money, or a young man, or possibly both. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Petherick the chemist confided to the landlord that he had refilled Mrs. Westcott's digitalis only 9 days ago, and had wondered at the time whether she was not, perhaps, taking rather more of it than her doctor had ordered. Each of these observations was, in its way, perfectly accurate, and each of them, taken alone, pointed in a slightly different direction. This, Miss Marple thought, when Griselda repeated them to her at luncheon, was one of the most curious features of village gossip. It was almost never wholly wrong, it was almost never wholly right, and it had the particular property of concealing, beneath its many small truths, the one large truth that would have made sense of them all. "They are saying," said Griselda, cutting a slice of cold pie, "that Alice will inherit everything." "Very possibly she will," said Miss Marple, "and that Mr. Ainsworth will be, how did Mrs. Price Ridley put it, sadly disappointed in his expectations." "I dare say he will. And that Miss Prynne? Well, Mrs. Hartnell says Miss Prynne has been seen coming out of the chemist's shop 3 times this month, and looking, she said, quite peculiar about the eyes." "Mrs. Hartnell," said Miss Marple gently, "sees a great many peculiar things about the eyes, chiefly I have sometimes thought, because she does not care to look at anything else." Griselda laughed in spite of herself, and then sobered. "But Jane, do you think—" Miss Marple was silent a moment, turning her wine-glass slowly by its stem. Then she said, in her softest voice, "I think, my dear, that what strikes me most about this morning is not what has been said, but what has not." Nobody in that drawing-room seemed surprised. Grieved, yes, or pretending to be. Frightened, one of them certainly. But nobody was surprised. And when a healthy woman of 58 is found dead in her chair at 7 in the morning, one would expect at least somebody to be surprised. Unless, said Griselda slowly, they were expecting it. Unless, Miss Marple agreed, they had been, one might almost say, rehearsing for it. She thought again of Alice's shoulders, which had trembled in so exact a rhythm, and of Miss Prynne, who had had cause to be cool-headed before, and of the little brown bottle, unstoppered, upon the writing-table, beside a letter that began, "My dear Alice, there is something I must tell you before it is too late," and it seemed to her that the dead woman, whom she had known slightly for 12 years, without ever quite liking or disliking, had, in that unfinished sentence, spoken more loudly than any of the living voices she had heard that morning. Outside, the church bell rang once for the half-hour. It rang, this time, with perfect composure, but Miss Marple, listening, thought that she could still hear, faintly beneath its steadiness, the small tremor of the earlier stroke. Somewhere in the village, she felt sure, a hand was still shaking. She rose, and reached for her shady straw hat. "I think," she said, "I shall walk up to the Grange this afternoon, my dear. Poor Alice will be quite alone, and Miss Prynne, I dare say, will be glad of a little conversation. People who have had cause to be cool-headed before are so very often, in my experience, the ones who most need someone to talk to." Griselda watched her friend go down the path between the delphiniums, small and neat beneath her hat, and reflected, not for the first time, that whoever in Fernhollow Grange had rehearsed for this morning had not yet rehearsed for Miss Marple. Section 3. A walk under the lime trees. Griselda's eyes followed Miss Marple to the bend of the lane, and there Miss Marple, having reached the shade of the first lime tree, paused a moment to settle her hat against a fresh breath of wind from the south. The afternoon had ripened into that particular English warmth in which the very insects seemed to move more thoughtfully. Bees hung about the wallflowers in a considering way, and the shadow of the church tower, which had that morning pointed so gently at nothing, now pointed with equal gentleness at the gates of Fernhollow Grange. She did not go directly to the Grange. It was not her habit, upon such occasions, to walk the shortest way. She turned instead down Church Lane, past the vicarage wall over which the roses were beginning at last to speak of themselves, past the corner where the two cottages leaned upon one another like elderly sisters, and past, in due course, the little chemist's shop of Mr. Petherick, whose bow window displayed, as it had displayed for 30 years, a great glass carboy of green liquid and another of red, and between them a small notice, "Prescriptions carefully dispensed." Mr. Petherick was not at that moment dispensing anything. He was seated on a high stool behind his counter, polishing his spectacles with a piece of chamois leather, and looking, Miss Marple thought as she pushed the door and set the bell above it into its familiar apologetic tinkle, decidedly relieved to have a visitor. "Miss Marple! Come in, come in. A dreadful business at the Grange. Dreadful. I have been thinking of nothing else." "That, Mr. Petherick," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what I hoped." He gave her the small, dry, gratified smile of the professional man who is about to be consulted, and then, remembering his position, arranged his face more gravely. "I don't know that I can, properly speaking, discuss a customer, you understand." "Of course you cannot," said Miss Marple. "That would be most improper. But we may, I think, discuss the weather, which has been, as you are about to observe, remarkably warm, and warmth, as you know, is very trying to persons who take digitalis." Mr. Petherick blinked, and then, slowly, permitted himself another smile. "Very trying indeed, very trying. Mrs. Westcott, poor lady, did complain to me only last week that the drops did not always seem to answer as they had done. She wondered, she said, whether the strength had, varied. I assured her it had not, and you refilled her bottle on the 23rd. 9 days ago. Yes. A full bottle, Mr. Petherick. A full bottle, Miss Marple. Sufficient, at 1 drop as required, for something under a month." Miss Marple looked absently at the carboy of green liquid. "It is astonishing, is it not," she said, "how a full bottle may become an empty one, without anybody being quite able to say when." Mr. Petherick's polishing hand grew still. "The bottle upon the writing-table," he said in a lower voice, "was not, I think, empty." "No," said Miss Marple. "It was unstoppered, but it was not empty. It was, however, considerably less full than a bottle refilled 9 days ago, at 1 drop as required, ought to have been. I noticed it particularly." "Dear me," said Mr. Petherick. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Dear, dear me." She bought a small packet of peppermints, which she did not intend to eat, and went out again into the sunlight. Inspector Slack, by this time, was in the Grange dining-room with his notebook open and his temper closing, questioning the household with what he took to be tact. He had had in his years about the county a good deal of dealing with Miss Marple, and his method now was to conduct his investigation on lines so unimaginative that no elderly lady, however observant, could accuse him of having missed the obvious being in this case that Miss Alice Westcott had quarrelled with her aunt the evening before, that she stood to inherit a comfortable competence, and that she had been the last person known to have seen Mrs. Westcott alive. "You quarrelled," said Slack, "over money." "We quarrelled," said Alice, "over Harold Ainsworth." Slack looked up sharply. His pencil, which had been prepared to write money, hesitated. He was, engaged to be engaged to my aunt," said Alice, with a small bitter twist of the mouth. That is how she liked to put it. "He came out here twice a week, drank her sherry, walked with her under the lime trees, and said pretty things about her hair. I told her he was a fortune hunter. She told me I was jealous. I told her I was not. That was true, Inspector. I was not jealous of Harold Ainsworth. I was frightened for her." "Frightened?" said Slack, in the voice of a man who had just been offered a piece of fish he had not ordered. "He is not a nice man," said Alice. "That," said Slack, "is a matter of opinion." "It is a matter," said Alice quietly, "of two other ladies in Somerset, who married him, and did not enjoy a long acquaintance with matrimony afterwards. I found it out. I told my aunt. She would not listen. We quarrelled. I went to bed. That is all." Slack wrote several things in his notebook, of which the largest, underlined twice, was the word motive. He had a professional respect for motives that could be underlined, and none at all for information about persons in Somerset which would take letters and time to verify. While this was proceeding, Miss Marple was crossing the lawn to the lime trees, at the far end of which was set a small wrought-iron seat. It was here, as the village knew, that Mrs. Westcott and Mr. Ainsworth had been in the habit of taking their afternoon walk, and it was here that Miss Marple now perceived, seated with her hands folded very still in her lap, the figure of Miss Prynne. The companion did not turn her head as Miss Marple approached, but when the old lady seated herself upon the other end of the bench, Miss Prynne said, without looking round, "You have been at the chemist's, Miss Marple." "I have." "He is a talkative man. He is a careful man. There is a difference." He mentioned nothing that a person listening at his window would not already have gathered. "I do not listen at windows," said Miss Prynne. "No," said Miss Marple mildly. "I did not think that you did. You have, if I may say so, a way of hearing what is said in rooms one is not in, without needing to press your ear against anything at all. It is a valuable accomplishment, and I dare say, in your position, a necessary one." Miss Prynne's pale hands tightened very slightly upon each other in her lap. "You have been 3 years at the Grange, I believe," Miss Marple continued, as though remarking upon the weather. 3 years and 2 months. And before that, Bath, and before that, Torquay. And before that, there was a silence. A single lime blossom detached itself and fell, with a slow, drifting deliberation, upon the gravel between them. "Before that," said Miss Prynne at last, "it does not signify." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple gently. "So many things do not signify, until suddenly they do. It is one of the sadder features of a long life, Miss Prynne, that one is never quite certain when one's own history is going to become other people's business." Miss Prynne turned her head, at last, and looked at her. Her face, Miss Marple observed, was not the face she had worn in the drawing-room that morning. In the drawing-room she had been colourless, without expression. Here, in the green light beneath the limes, she had a face that had known a great deal and forgotten none of it. It was not, Miss Marple thought, an unpleasant face. It was merely a face that had learned, at some cost, to hold itself very still. "Mrs. Westcott," said Miss Prynne, "was writing a letter last night to her niece. She began it after dinner in the drawing-room. She wrote 3 lines, and then she said, no, not tonight, tomorrow. I shall tell her tomorrow." "And what," said Miss Marple, "was she going to tell her?" "I do not know, but you have a guess." Miss Prynne was silent again. Then she said, in the same flat voice she had used to the inspector, "She was going to break off with Mr. Ainsworth. She had discovered something. Yesterday afternoon a letter came for her, from Somerset. She read it twice. She put it in the fire, and then she said, quite quietly, the girl was right, after all. She meant Miss Alice." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Overhead, a single bee moved among the lime flowers, and the shadow of a cloud passed briefly across the lawn and away, so that the light where the 2 women sat brightened and then dimmed and then, very softly, brightened again. "Thank you," said Miss Marple. "That, I think, is a great deal more than I had a right to expect." "I have told you," said Miss Prynne evenly, "only what any decent person would tell. Mrs. Westcott was kind to me. If she was helped out of the world, I should not wish it to be by the wrong hands. "No," said Miss Marple, "one would not. It is very important, is it not, that a thing of that kind should be laid at the right door?" She rose. The lime blossom that had fallen still lay upon the gravel between them, its faint sweetness rising through the warm afternoon. As she walked back across the lawn towards the house, she was thinking, quite calmly, that Miss Prynne had told her the truth about the letter from Somerset, and that Miss Prynne had also, in the same breath, told her a lie. She had not yet decided which of the two mattered most. That, she thought, would depend on the bell tomorrow morning, and upon whose hand, this time, would be found to be shaking. Section 4. A solicitor in the drawing-room. The lime blossom still lay between them on the gravel, as Miss Marple's small figure receded across the lawn, and it lay there some little while after, because Miss Prynne did not move to disturb it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap in the attitude of a woman waiting for a train that she is not in fact at all anxious to catch, and only when the shadow of the yew hedge had crept a full inch across the grass did she rise, smooth her grey skirt with a single downward pass of her palm, and walk back towards the house by a way that did not oblige her to cross her own footprints. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had reached the terrace. The tall French windows of the drawing-room stood open, and through them came a voice, a masculine voice, resonant, well-pitched, and just a shade too consciously composed, which was saying, "My dear Inspector, I need hardly tell you that this is the most appalling blow. Eleanor and I, well, there are matters of which a gentleman does not speak, but you may take it from me that this house had, in her, a mistress who is quite irreplaceable." The house had, in her, Miss Marple thought, a woman who had decided the night before to be rid of him. She paused at the threshold, drew off her gloves, and permitted herself to be observed. Mr. Harold Ainsworth had risen at her entrance, for he was, whatever else he might be, a man who understood the small forms, and now stood with one hand resting lightly upon the back of a chair, in the pose of a solicitor engaged in a difficult codicil. He was a tall man, well made, with dark hair going handsomely grey at the temples, a slightly full mouth, and eyes of a light hazel colour that seemed always to be measuring the value of the furniture. He wore a dark suit of very good cloth, and a black tie of very recent purchase. "Miss Marple," he said with a bow, "I am delighted, that is to say, in these sorrowful circumstances, I am relieved to see a familiar face. Poor Eleanor spoke of you often." "She did not," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "but it is very kind of you to say so." There was a small silence, during which Inspector Slack, who had risen also, contrived to look both gratified and inconvenienced at once. Alice, from her chair by the grate, gave Miss Marple a swift, grateful look, and Mr. Ainsworth's easy smile did not in the least alter. He was, Miss Marple perceived, a man whom small pinpricks did not disturb. He was reserving himself for larger occasions. "Do sit down, Mr. Ainsworth," said Miss Marple. "I shall not stay a moment. I merely wish to bring poor Alice a little bottle of my elderflower water, which I always find soothing in a house of trouble, and to say how very shocked we all are, of course." She placed the little bottle upon the table with a soft, deliberate tap. It stood there, small, unstoppered, brown, a modest twin to that other small brown bottle which still sat, at the inspector's insistence, upon the writing table 3 yards away. Alice's eyes went to it, and then to the other, and then, involuntarily, up to Miss Marple's face. Miss Marple was gazing benignly at a Dresden shepherdess upon the mantelpiece. "Very thoughtful," said Mr. Ainsworth, "very thoughtful indeed. Eleanor always spoke of you as one of the, pillars of the village." "She spoke of me," said Miss Marple, as an old woman who noticed rather more than was becoming. It was one of her kinder remarks. "Mr." Ainsworth laughed politely, as though at a witticism which he did not entirely follow, and Slack cleared his throat and said, "Well now, perhaps, Miss Marple, since you have brought your, cordial, you might sit with Miss Westcott a moment, while I take Mr. Ainsworth into the library. There are a few small formalities." "By all means, Inspector." The two men went out. When the door had closed, Alice looked at Miss Marple with eyes suddenly hollow. "He is going to arrest me," she said. "Isn't he?" "Not yet, my dear." "But he will." "He will consider it," said Miss Marple. "Inspector Slack is a very considering man. He is considering it now. It is not the same thing as doing it. Aunt Eleanor was going to change her will." "Ah," said Miss Marple gently. "Was she? When did she tell you so?" "Last night, in this room, after dinner. She said she had had a letter from a solicitor in Somerset, not Harold, another one, and that she had been a foolish woman, and that in the morning she would telephone Harold and tell him not to come again, and that she would go into market basing on Thursday and put things right about the money. She said—" Alice's voice trembled, but her eyes remained dry, and Miss Marple noted this with a small inward nod. She said that I had been a good girl to warn her. She had never called me a good girl before, and I was ashamed, Miss Marple. I had spoken to her so unkindly, so many times. Yes, said Miss Marple, that is often the shape of it. We reserve our kindness for those who no longer need it. It is one of the sadder economies of the heart. And now Inspector Slack thinks in straight lines, my dear. It is his profession. He must be forgiven for it. There was a footstep in the hall, and Miss Prynne came in. She glanced at the two of them, at the little bottle upon the table, at the writing table, and then, without a word, she crossed to the window and closed the French doors, as though she had felt a draught which nobody else had noticed. Then she seated herself on the window seat, folded her hands, and remained. Miss Marple, watching her, was reminded of a governess she had known in her girlhood, a Miss Latimer, who had come to a house near Danamid when Miss Marple was 15. Miss Latimer had had exactly Miss Prynne's habit of arriving in a room a moment after she was wanted, and remaining in it a moment after she was not, and she had been in the end a very quiet accomplice to a very noisy scandal. Miss Marple had not thought of Miss Latimer for 40 years. She thought of her now. In the library, meanwhile, Slack was going through Mr. Ainsworth's movements of the previous evening with the dogged thoroughness of a plough turning a heavy field. Mr. Ainsworth had dined at the White Hart in Market Basing until 9:30. He had driven home, alone, arriving at his rooms by 10. He had gone to bed at 11. He had risen at 7. He had heard the news at 9, from a clerk. All of this could be verified, and Slack knew would in due course be verified, by waiters, landlords, and the clerk aforesaid. It was a thoroughly satisfactory alibi, and Slack, who did not care for satisfactory alibis and principles, wrote it down with a certain sourness. But it was, on the face of it, a fact. "You were," Slack said, on terms of some, intimacy with the deceased. "We were engaged," said Mr. Ainsworth, easily. "Not formally, not for announcement. We had agreed that at our time of life such things were best kept quiet until the arrangements were made. But we understood one another. Financial arrangements, sir?" "Personal arrangements," said Mr. Ainsworth with a small, reproachful smile. "You have, if I may say so, Inspector, a somewhat austere idea of what passes between grown persons." "I have," said Slack, "a very austere idea of what passes between fortune hunters and elderly widows. But we needn't go into that. You were not then aware that Mrs. Westcott had intended to break off the understanding?" Mr. Ainsworth's face did not alter, not a muscle of it. Only the light hazel eyes for 1/2 second moved to the window and back. "That," he said, "is a most extraordinary suggestion. May I ask upon what it is founded?" "On something Miss Westcott has told us." "Ah, Miss Westcott." Mr. Ainsworth allowed himself a small sigh of the professional man who has seen many young women misled by their own feelings. "Miss Westcott has, I am afraid, disliked me from the first. It is not a thing one takes personally. Young ladies dislike gentlemen who, how shall I put it, reduce their expectations. I bear her no ill will, but I should be sorry to see her testimony taken as evidence of what her aunt intended." "Quite," said Slack. He wrote nothing. He merely regarded Mr. Ainsworth with the sort of look that a good gardener gives a plant he has not yet decided whether to keep or uproot, and Mr. Ainsworth, meeting the look, produced from an inner pocket a slim leather case, extracted a card, and laid it upon the desk. "I am, of course," he said, "entirely at your disposal, whenever you should require me." "I shall," said Slack. When Mr. Ainsworth had gone, Slack noted, without asking a single question about the manner or the time of the death, though he had inquired with great care about the funeral, the inspector sat for some minutes staring at the card, and then took himself back to the drawing-room. He found Miss Marple upon the point of leaving. "A word, if I may," he said. She followed him into the hall. "That young woman," said Slack in a lowered voice, "quarrelled with her aunt over money and a young man. She stands to inherit. She was the last to see the deceased alive, and the deceased was writing to her, when she died, a letter beginning, 'There is something I must tell you before it is too late.' Miss Marple, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. It seems to me a plain enough case." "Plain cases," said Miss Marple gently, "are so very often the ones one afterwards regrets." "You do not believe she did it?" "I do not, Inspector, believe that Alice Westcott killed her aunt. I believe that Alice Westcott is a foolish, warm-hearted, quick-tongued young woman who last night, for the first time in her life, discovered that her aunt loved her, and that a young woman who has just discovered that is not, as a rule, in any hurry to leave her aunt behind." Slack grunted. "That is not evidence." "No," said Miss Marple. "It is only human nature. I am aware, Inspector, that the two are not always considered the same thing. but in my long experience they very often turn out to be." She smiled at him gently and went out. On the terrace she paused. From the drawing-room window she could see Alice, small in her chair, and Miss Prynne, still upon the window-seat, and, on the table between them, her own little bottle of elderflower water, and, 3 yards away, that other bottle upon the writing-table. 2 small brown bottles, in a house where a healthy woman had unexpectedly died. 2 women, in a room where a third had been writing a letter, and somewhere, not in this house, but not far from it, a fortune-hunter in a black tie, who had not inquired about the manner of the death. The motif, she thought, was beginning to sharpen. It was the motif of the interrupted letter, the sentence that had begun and had not been permitted to end. Somebody in this village, she felt sure, had made a habit, over many years, of interrupting other people's sentences before they could become dangerous, and that somebody was, at this moment, walking about St. Mary Mead with a perfectly steady hand. Section 5. The sentence that was not finished. Miss Marple's small, deliberate figure descended the drive of Fernhollow Grange as the afternoon began at last to lengthen, and the shadow of the church tower, which had followed her about the village all day like a courteous but persistent acquaintance, now stretched itself the whole length of the gravel, and touched, with its dark tip, the iron gate as she closed it behind her. She paused there a moment, one gloved hand upon the top bar, and looked back at the house. The tall French windows of the drawing-room were still open, and framed in one of them, quite still, stood Miss Prynne. She was not looking at Miss Marple. She was looking, with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read at that distance, at the writing-table upon which the small brown bottle still stood. Then the shadow of a moving cloud passed across the terrace, and when it had passed the window was empty. Miss Marple walked home slowly, thinking. She was thinking not of Miss Prynne, nor of Alice, nor of Mr. Ainsworth in his becomingly new black tie, but of a phrase, a mere half-sentence, in a firm, angular hand, which had been begun the night before, and had never been permitted to finish. "My dear Alice, there is something I must tell you before it is too late." The words repeated themselves in her mind with the small, insistent rhythm of a thing that has not yet been understood. Before it is too late. Before it is too late for what? Not before she died, surely, Mrs. Westcott had not known, at 10 o'clock the previous night, that she was to die by 7 the next morning. No, before it is too late meant something quite other. It meant, Miss Marple thought, before some door somewhere in the house should close and become impossible to open again. She had reached her own gate before she noticed that Griselda was leaning over it, and that Griselda's face, which had that morning worn only the pink flush of news, now wore a considerably graver colour. "Jane," said Griselda, "the maid Ellen has been here." "Ellen from the Grange?" "Yes." She walked over. She would not come in. She stood on the path and said she wished to speak to you privately, and when I said you were out she said she would go home, and I asked her whether it was important, and she said, "Jane," she said, "it's about the fire, ma'am. There was something burnt last night that oughtn't to have been burnt." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her small hand tightened, quite unconsciously, upon the packet of unwanted peppermints in her pocket. "Something burnt," she repeated softly. "In which grate?" "That is what I asked her," she said in Mrs. Westcott's own bedroom grate, upstairs. "It had been laid," she said, "ready for morning, but not lit. The nights have been so warm. And this morning, when she went in to open the shutters, the fire had been lit and had gone out again, and there was, she said this quite particularly, Jane, a great deal of pale ash in it, more than any little bit of paper would make." "A great deal of pale ash," said Miss Marple. "Yes." And Ellen said, "She is deaf, you know, and she has that way deaf people have, of saying things straight out," she said. "That fire was lit by hand, Miss Marple, and it wasn't the mistress's hand." Miss Marple was silent a moment. Then she said, "Come inside, my dear. There is something I should like to show you." In her small parlour, from the escritoire in the corner, she produced a sheet of writing paper and a pen, and laid them upon the table. "Sit down, dear," she said. "I want you to try a little experiment. You are to imagine that you are Mrs. Westcott. It is 10 o'clock at night. You are in your drawing-room. You have determined to write to your niece, in the morning, a letter of some importance. But you have already, tonight, written another letter, to whom we do not yet know. That letter you have finished and sealed. Where, at 10 o'clock, would you put it?" Griselda considered. "In the post-tray in the hall? Or, no, if it were private, in my own bureau upstairs." "Precisely, in your own bureau upstairs. And if on some later occasion, say, in the small hours, a person were to enter that bureau and take out that letter, and go down again, and lay a fire in the bedroom grate that had not been laid to be lit, and burn that letter there so that its ash should not fall into a public grate, What would we call that person? Griselda. A person, said Griselda slowly, who did not wish that letter to be found. A person, said Miss Marple, who knew the letter existed, who knew where it was kept, who knew the ways of the house at night, and who was moreover sufficiently in possession of themselves after Mrs. Westcott's death to think of such a thing at all. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap. Somebody in Fern Hollow, my dear, has burnt a letter. It is not the letter to Alice. That letter, unfinished, lies still upon the writing table, and Inspector Slack has custody of it. It is another letter, and what I begin to think, Griselda, is that the small brown bottle, and the digitalis, and the wing chair, and even poor Alice's quarrel, that all these things were arranged, quite carefully, to make us look at the drawing-room, whereas what somebody did not wish us to look at was upstairs, in a bedroom grate, where the ash lies pale and rather more than a little bit of paper would make. Griselda breathed out slowly. Then it is not Alice. I never believed, my dear, that it was Alice. It is Mr. Ainsworth? Miss Marple's pale eyes rested upon the pattern of the carpet. Mr. Ainsworth, she said, has a very good alibi. He spent the evening at the White Hart in Market Basing, which is, I dare say, a perfectly true statement of where he was. It has always struck me, Griselda, as one of the small ironies of these matters, that the fortune hunter, when he has decided to kill, so very rarely does it himself. He has, you see, a professional reputation to protect. Then, Miss Prynne? Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was thinking of Miss Prynne as she had appeared in the window of the drawing-room, gazing at the small brown bottle, and of Miss Prynne as she had sat beneath the lime trees, with a face which had known a great deal and forgotten none of it. She was also, though she did not say so, thinking of a governess named Miss Latimer, who had come once to a house near Dannemede when Miss Marple was 15. Miss Prynne, she said at last, told me this afternoon that Mrs. Westcott, yesterday, received a letter from Somerset, read it twice, put it in the fire in the drawing-room, and said, the girl was right, after all. Well, there is no fire in the drawing-room, my dear. It is June. The grate has been laid with paper flowers by Ellen quite prettily since the beginning of May. I noticed it this morning. If Mrs. Westcott destroyed that letter last night, she did not destroy it in the drawing-room. She destroyed it, I feel sure, in her own bedroom grate upstairs, which grate, this morning, contained a great deal more pale ash than a little bit of paper would make. Griselda's eyes widened. Then Miss Prynne knew. Miss Prynne was upstairs last night. Miss Prynne saw what was burnt. Miss Prynne, said Miss Marple, told me the truth about the letter from Somerset, and Miss Prynne told me, in the same breath, a lie about where it was burnt. It is a peculiar combination, Griselda. It suggests to me a woman who is very anxious that we should know one thing, and very anxious that we should not know another. And it suggests also, for people who have spent their lives being of no importance rarely trouble to lie unless they are protecting someone, that Miss Prynne is not at this moment alone in her secret. She rose and went to the window and looked out down the lane towards Fern Hollow. The lime trees stirred a little in the evening breeze, and the church bell, striking the 3/4, struck it firmly and with composure. But Miss Marple, listening, thought that the composure of that bell was of a different quality from its composure in the morning. It was the composure of a man who has done what he set out to do and is at ease. The tremor, wherever it had been, had passed elsewhere. Griselda, she said, without turning, tomorrow morning I should like you to do a small errand for me. Go to the vicarage, no, better, go to Mrs. Bantry, and inquire, very casually, whether Mrs. Westcott ever spoke to her of anyone by the name of Latimer, or it may have been shortened Latty. Latimer, said Griselda, writing it in her small pocket-book, and ask her also, if she does not think it forward, whether she has ever met or heard mentioned a Miss Emily Prynne in the counties of Devon or Somerset, 30 years ago. Say, if she asks, that it is for a benevolent society. She will not believe you, but she will not press the point. 30 years ago, said Griselda. 30 years ago, my dear. It is not, I dare say, so long as it sounds. It is only about the length of time that a certain sort of person, having done a certain sort of thing, can persuade themselves that nobody remembers. She turned from the window. The evening light lay warm upon the pattern of the carpet, and upon her folded hands, and upon the small sheet of writing paper on the table, that sheet upon which she had asked Griselda, a little while before, to imagine herself Mrs. Westcott at 10 o'clock in a drawing-room, with 2 letters to be written, and one of them not yet safe. The motif of the interrupted sentence, which had touched her that morning in the hall of Fern Hollow, had now begun to darken. It was no longer only the sentence Mrs. Westcott had begun, and not been suffered to end. It was, she perceived, a sentence begun 30 years ago in another county. Interrupted then, taken up again in Bath, interrupted again, taken up once more in St. Abe, Mary Mead, and this time, this morning, interrupted with a small brown bottle and a wing chair and a pen fallen at the feet of a woman who had had, at last, something she meant to tell. Somebody in this village, said Miss Marple gently to the delphiniums beyond the window, has been a very long time being silent, and they are, I am afraid, only just beginning to speak. Section 6. What Mrs. Bantry remembered. The delphiniums beyond the window bowed once in the evening breeze, and Griselda, taking up her small pocket-book and her small commission together, went out through the low gate and down the lane towards the vicarage. And the next morning, before 10 o'clock, she was at Gossington Hall, taking coffee with Dolly Bantry in the long, sunny morning-room whose windows looked upon the rose-beds. Mrs. Bantry, at 62, was still large, still handsome, still capable of remembering the exact colour of a hat worn at a wedding in 1908 and the exact tone of a remark made across a whist table in 1917. She heard Griselda out with her head a little on one side and her eyes half closed, as a robin listens for a worm. "Latimer," she said at last. "Latimer, my dear child, one has known Latimers, of course. There is a Sir Charles Latimer in Devon, but he is a bore and unmarried. But you say your Miss Marple asks specifically. Miss Marple never asks specifically without a reason." She rang for more coffee, and when the maid had gone, added, "Is it about Eleanor?" "Everything," said Griselda, "is about Eleanor." "Then let me think." Mrs. Bantry closed her eyes altogether. "Latty, Latty. Eleanor did once, she did once, my dear, mention a Latty. It was years ago. It was here, in this room. Arthur was still, Arthur was alive, so it was before 1925. Eleanor had come over to lunch. She had been reading something in a newspaper, I think a report of an inquest, and she said, quite suddenly, 'That reminds me of poor Latty, poor pretty foolish Latty.' And I said, 'Who is poor Latty?' And she looked at me, my dear, as though she had said more than she meant, and she said, 'Oh, nobody you would know. A girl I was at school with. She died.' And she changed the subject to the plums, which were being difficult that year." "Died how?" said Griselda. "That she did not say. But you know, Grisel, there was something Eleanor's face when she said it. Not sorrow exactly, a kind of anger held down, as though the death had been a nuisance to Latty, and rather more of a nuisance to somebody else. And a Miss Prynne? Emily Prynne?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "That name I do not know, but Prynne, there was a Prynne who kept a small hotel at Sidmouth, a great many years ago, whose daughter was, dear me, this is going to be idle gossip, and I promised Arthur when he died I should give up idle gossip, whose daughter was, they said, in some trouble. She went away. There was a companion, a paid companion, with an elderly lady in Torquay, whom the daughter of the Sidmouth Prynnes is supposed to have become. But this is 30 years back, Grisel. 30 years and more. 30 years, said Griselda softly, is only about the length of time that a certain sort of person can persuade themselves that nobody remembers. That, said Mrs. Bantry, opening her eyes, sounds uncommonly like Jane. At that moment, in the drawing-room of Fernhollow Grange, Miss Marple herself was sitting upon a small chair by the window, and opposite her, upon the sofa, sat Alice Westcott, thinner already than the day before, with her hair pinned quietly and her eyes clear. Between them, upon a low table, stood a tea-tray. The little brown bottle upon the writing-table was gone. Inspector Slack had taken it away, together with the interrupted letter, and both were, at that moment, in the hands of an analyst in Much Benham. "They have moved my aunt to the chapel," Alice said. "I have not been in. Miss Prynne has been in twice. She sat with her, she said, a full half-hour. It seems a strange thing, doesn't it, when they were not close? I wouldn't have thought Miss Prynne cared for her." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "She cared for her more than either of them knew." Alice looked at her. "You do not think Miss Prynne—" "I do not at present think anything, my dear. I am collecting." "Tell me, because you were here, and I was not. Was there ever, in the 3 years Miss Prynne has been at the Grange, any moment when your aunt seemed to know something of her past that you did not?" Alice considered. "Once," she said slowly. "Only once. It was last autumn. Miss Prynne had gone into the village on some errand, and Aunt Eleanor was sitting where you sit now, going through a pile of old letters. She stopped over one of them. She read it. She held it a long time. Then she looked up, and she said, half to herself, half to me, 'Poor thing, poor thing. One should not perhaps judge.' And she put the letter into the drawer of her bureau, and she locked the drawer. She had never before, in my knowledge, locked that drawer. And afterwards, did she treat Miss Prynne any differently? Yes, she was kinder, rather markedly kinder. She spoke to her almost as an equal. It made Miss Prynne nervous, I think. Miss Prynne does not like kindness. She likes to be spoken to as a companion. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That is very interesting, my dear. That is very interesting indeed, because it suggests, does it not, that your aunt had, at some point last autumn, come into possession of information about Miss Prynne's history, information which she chose, in her own way, to keep, and that Miss Prynne was aware of this. Yes, and that yesterday, when your aunt received her letter from Somerset, and Miss Prynne saw her receive it, Miss Prynne will have believed, perhaps quite mistakenly, that the two matters had come together, that the letter from Somerset was, in some way, about her. But you said it was about Mr. Ainsworth. It was about Mr. Ainsworth, and your aunt read it, and said, the girl was right after all. She meant you. But Miss Prynne, who did not read it, who only saw the envelope, and the county on the postmark, Miss Prynne cannot have known this. She will have been given every reason to suppose that her employer had at last decided to act upon what she had known these many months. Alice's face had grown pale. Then Miss Prynne, said Miss Marple gently, I believe to have spent a great deal of yesterday afternoon in a state of considerable fear. She rose and went to the writing table, which, though the bottle and the letter had been removed, still bore the small marks of the morning before, the faint ring left by the base of the bottle, the fainter stain of the fallen ink. She stood there looking down at it a long moment, and then said, without turning, Alice, my dear, would you telephone the White Hart in Market Basing and ask them a single question? Ask them whether Mr. Ainsworth, on the night before last, dined alone, and, if not alone, in what company? Slack has already asked whether Mr. Ainsworth was there, and at what hour. That is not the same question. Alice went into the hall. When she came back some minutes later, her face was blank with the peculiar blankness that follows a small unpleasant discovery. He was there, she said. He was there all the evening, but he was not alone. He dined with a lady. The waiter remembers her because she was, the waiter's word, quiet. She was quiet, and she wore grey. She left before he did, at about 9:15. She did not have a name, so far as the waiter overheard, but she took the last bus from Market Basing to St. Mary Mead. Ah, said Miss Marple very softly, so she did. She sat down again. The morning had, without her observing it, brightened. The sun through the window laid a broad, warm bar across the carpet, and touched the edge of the tea-tray, and made for one instant the empty air where the small brown bottle had stood shine with something like the ghost of itself. Miss Marple looked at this brightness with her mild, considering eyes. Then she said, Alice, do not, upon any account, mention this to Miss Prynne. No, and do not, upon any account, be alone with her in the house today. No. There is nothing, said Miss Marple, so dangerous as a woman who has spent 30 years being of no importance, and who has at last been noticed, especially by a fortune hunter and by a mistress. It is a combination which, in my experience, has ended almost always in some disagreeable fashion. Alice sat very still for a moment. Then she said, in a small voice, Miss Marple, do you mean that Miss Prynne and Mr. Ainsworth are— I mean, my dear, that a solicitor with 2 wives already in Somerset does not as a rule come out twice a week to a country house merely to court a widow of 58. He comes to acquire her, and to acquire a person, in the way Mr. Ainsworth acquires them. One requires an ally in the house, preferably an ally who is very quiet, and wears grey, and takes the last bus home. There was the sound of a door in the hall, and after a moment Miss Prynne came in her flat grey dress, her hands folded, her face composed. She saw Miss Marple, and paused a second longer than was quite natural, and then, quite easily, she said, Miss Marple, Miss Westcott, there is a man from the vicarage at the door. He has brought word that Dr. Haydock wishes Miss Westcott to come across at once. There is something he must speak to her about. Thank you, said Alice. She rose, gathering her shawl. Miss Marple did not rise. She sat where she was, with her hands folded upon her lap in a most perfect imitation of Miss Prynne's own attitude, and said pleasantly, I shall stay a little, if I may. It is very restful in this room, and Miss Prynne, I dare say, will keep me company. Miss Prynne's colourless eyes met Miss Marple's pale ones for a single, still moment. Then Miss Prynne said, tonelessly, Of course, it will be a pleasure. Alice went out. The door closed. The 2 women were alone. Somewhere, distantly, the church bell rang the quarter. Neither of them so much as glanced at the clock. Miss Marple picked up her teacup, and observed, in the mildest of voices, The trouble with wearing grey, Miss Prynne, is that one is so often remembered by the colour, when one had rather have been forgotten altogether. Miss Prynne's hands, folded in her lap, did not move, but upon the back of the right one, quite suddenly, a small blue vein began to beat. Section 7. The second bottle. The small blue vein upon the back of Miss Prynne's hand beat once, twice, and then, by an effort which Miss Marple could almost feel across the space of the tea-tray, subsided. Miss Prynne's face did not alter. Her eyes remained upon Miss Marple's with the flat, unreflecting steadiness of a mill-pond at evening, when the wind has dropped and one can no longer be sure whether the surface hides an inch of water or 20 feet. "You are very fond, Miss Marple," she said, "of remarks that have two meanings." "An old woman's habit," said Miss Marple. "One begins to say too little, from politeness, and then one begins to say too much, from mischief, and then, at last, one settles into saying only the things that mean two other things. It is not, I dare say, an improvement, but it is, at our age, a comfort." "And which," said Miss Prynne, "were you offering me just now? The politeness, or the mischief, or the comfort?" "The truth, my dear, which is, I have sometimes noticed, the least mistakable of the three." They looked at one another. In the hall the great clock, which had been set again after its stop at 10 minutes past 4, ticked composedly. Somewhere upstairs a shutter creaked, and outside a wood-pigeon, wholly indifferent to the affairs of Fernhollow Grange, offered from the top of a lime-tree its two blunt, complacent notes. Miss Prynne's hands unfolded themselves and refolded themselves the other way about, right hand over left, as though she were correcting the position of a piece upon a chessboard. Then she said, quietly, "I dined at the White Hart the night before last, Miss Marple. I dined with Mr. Ainsworth. We had known each other, slightly, some years ago in Torquay. He wrote to me a fortnight since. He wished, he said, to consult me upon a private matter. I went. I regretted going almost at once. There is nothing else, Miss Marple, that I have to tell you upon that subject. There is nothing else, then, that you wish to tell me. There is a great deal else, I fancy, that you have to. I am not so far aware of it. Yesterday afternoon, Miss Prynne, beneath the lime trees, you said to me that Mrs. Westcott had received a letter from Somerset, that she had read it twice, that she had put it in the fire in the drawing-room, that she had said, the girl was right after all. Do you still say so? I do. There has been no fire in the drawing-room, Miss Prynne, since the beginning of May. The blue vein beat again. I misspoke, said Miss Prynne without expression. It was the bedroom fire, upstairs. I went up with her when she took the letter. I saw her burn it. Ah, said Miss Marple with great gentleness. And afterwards you came down again together? Yes. And that was at what hour? About 9:30, and the fire in the bedroom, Miss Prynne, on a warm night in June, was not laid to be lit. Ellen laid it, as she always does, for morning, and it had not been lit yet. Who lit it? Miss Prynne did not answer. Somebody, said Miss Marple in the same soft voice, lit that fire between 10 last night and 7 this morning. Somebody burnt in it more paper than Mrs. Westcott destroyed at 9:30. Ellen swept out the grate this morning, and there was, she said, a great deal of pale ash, more than a single letter would make. And somebody, Miss Prynne, is the person we shall in the end find to have killed your mistress. There was at that point a small clear sound from the hall, the click, unmistakable, of the front door being opened by a person who had a key. Both women turned their heads. It was Mr. Ainsworth. He came in without waiting to be announced, hat in hand, black tie composed, and the slight ease of manner of a gentleman who has decided that he now belongs in this house. At sight of the two of them in the drawing-room he checked, one instant only, and then advanced with a bow. Miss Marple! Miss Prynne! Forgive me, I thought Alice was here. I have come, one had to come, to ask if there was anything one might do. Alice has been called to doctor. Haydocks, said Miss Marple. But do come in, Mr. Ainsworth. We were, in a manner of speaking, expecting you. His hazel eyes moved almost imperceptibly to Miss Prynne. Were you? An intuition merely, said Miss Marple. One so often has intuitions in a house of trouble. Sit down. Miss Prynne was about to tell me. I think you would find it of interest, of a small dinner at the White Hart, the night before last. There was then a silence which had the queer property of being not silent at all. It was full, at its edges, of the small ordinary noises of the room, the pigeon, the shutter, the clock, the distant hoof of a pony on the lane, and empty at its centre of any sound that meant anything. Miss Prynne did not raise her eyes. Mr. Ainsworth's mouth did not move, but the muscle at the hinge of his jaw did, once. Miss Prynne is mistaken, he said. I have not dined at the White Hart these 3 weeks. The waiter, said Miss Marple, remembers your companion by her dress. He does not always remember gentlemen. He remembers ladies. The waiter is confused. Very possibly, said Miss Marple. Waiters so often are. And yet, upon the whole, I am inclined to believe him. I have found in my long experience Mr. Ainsworth, that a person who has once served soup to a lady in grey does not easily mistake her for anybody else. Grey is such an insisting colour. It disappears in the eye and remains in the memory. I cannot think why. Mr. Ainsworth's face was still very composed, but he did not sit down. He stood by the mantelpiece, one hand upon it, in the pose of a man who has not yet decided whether he has walked into a drawing-room or into a courtroom, and is inclined to withdraw from either. At this moment, from the direction of the hall, came a second sound. Not the click of a latch, but the heavier tread of official boots. Inspector Slack entered without ceremony, followed by Sergeant Lake and by Dr. Haydock, whose face wore the particular grim mildness of a doctor who has just performed an analysis and does not intend to be pleasant about it. "Ah," said Slack, taking in the room at a glance. "You are here also, Mr. Ainsworth. It saves me a journey. Miss Marple, Miss Prynne. I have news." He held up, between his gloved fingers, a small brown bottle. It was not the bottle from the writing table. That bottle was, at this hour, in much Benham with the analyst. This was another, smaller, its label a shade darker with age, its glass a little duller. It was the fellow to the first as a shadow as the fellow to a body, unmistakably of the same kind, and unmistakably not the same. "This bottle," said Slack, "was found within the last hour, wrapped in a piece of oiled paper, at the bottom of the coal bunker at the back of the Grange. It is Digitalis tincture. It bears the label of Mr. Petherick's shop. It was made up, upon his register 4 months ago, to the order of the deceased, upon repeat prescription. It ought, at this date, to be either empty upon her dressing-table or thrown away. It was, however, in the coal bunker, and it is 3/4 full." Dr. Haydock spoke then, in a voice that was low and quite level. "The bottle upon the writing-table this morning, Slack, contained a fluid at approximately 3 times the strength that Mr. Petherick dispenses. My man in Much Benham confirmed it by telephone at 11. It was Digitalis, yes, but not Mr. Petherick's Digitalis. It was Digitalis to which more Digitalis had been added, from another bottle, from, in short, this bottle, or one like it. Whoever emptied out the strengthened bottle first, and drained a portion of it into Mrs. Westcott's evening cordial, needed then to conceal what remained of the original weaker stuff, and so into the coal bunker. 2 bottles, said Miss Marple softly, a weak one hidden, a strong one displayed, and a woman, between them, made silent. Slack's small hard eyes went round the room, to Miss Prynne upon the sofa, to Mr. Ainsworth by the mantelpiece, to Miss Marple in her low chair. Then they returned, and rested upon Mr. Ainsworth. "Sir," said Slack, "I must ask you again where you were the night before last, and I must warn you that a witness has been found who states that you were in the company of Miss Prynne at the White Hart until 9:15, and that your motor car was not in your own yard at Market Basing at 10, as your clerk supposed, but was seen quite plainly, sir, turning into the lane behind Fern Hollow at 5 minutes past 10, and again coming out at 11:30. Mr. Ainsworth's hand upon the mantelpiece tightened, but his face, remarkably, did not lose its composure. He was, Miss Marple perceived with a faint interior sigh, a man of unusual nerve, the sort of man who would carry a bad hand of cards to the end of the rubber upon the chance that the other players would misdeal. "That is a very grave accusation, Inspector," he said, "founded, I gather, upon village gossip and a mistaken waiter. I refuse to answer it in a drawing-room. I shall answer it, if I must, in the presence of my own solicitor. Meanwhile, if you will permit me," and he made as if to move towards the door. "You will not, sir," said Slack, "leave this house today except in my company." It was at this moment that Miss Prynne spoke, and her voice, when she spoke, had altered so completely that it took Miss Marple, who was accustomed to alterations, a full second to recognise it. It had in it no trace of the flat companion's tone. It was low, clear, and very tired, the voice of a person who has for many years carried an intolerable weight, and who has at this moment, without warning, set it down. "He was here," said Miss Prynne, "at 10:05. He came in through the garden door. I opened it for him. He went upstairs to Mrs. Westcott's bedroom. He was there some 7 minutes. He came down. He left by the garden door. That is what I have to tell you, Inspector. Please write it down." Mr. Ainsworth turned upon her with a face which had for one instant forgotten to be composed. It was a face Miss Marple had been waiting to see, and having seen it, she knew, with the calm certainty that came to her upon such occasions, that she was in the presence not of one murderer but of 2, and that of the 2, the one at the mantelpiece was by a great deal the less dangerous. Section 8. The test at the tea-table. The face that Mr. Ainsworth turned upon Miss Prynne lasted no more than the space of a heartbeat, but in that space it lost, quite completely, the appearance of a gentleman, and acquired the appearance of a creature that has been startled by a light in a dark yard. His mouth thinned. The light hazel eyes narrowed to two small metallic points, and the hand that had rested so easily upon the mantelpiece closed once upon nothing. Then, with a rapidity that had in it something almost professional, the gentleman came back. The mouth softened, the eyes widened again into their measuring courteousness. The hand resumed its careless posture upon the marble. He was, Miss Marple thought with a small inner shiver, a very practised man. "My dear Emily," he said gently, and it was the first time in that room she had been called by her Christian name. "You are unwell. You have been unwell since yesterday morning. Inspector, this poor creature has been under a strain no woman of her constitution could reasonably bear. I entreat you to disregard entirely." "Mr. Ainsworth," said Inspector Slack, "you will not, if you please, address the witness." "I was here," said Miss Prynne again in the same low, tired voice. "He was here. He went up the stairs. I stood in the passage. I heard him move the little bottle upon the dressing table. I heard him come down. He said to me at the garden door, 'You will find her tomorrow. You will find her at 7. Do not go in before 7. Then he went out. That is all." "That," said Slack, "is not all. That is not by a great deal all. Sergeant Lake, take Mr. Ainsworth into the library. Sit with him. He is not to speak, nor to write, nor to leave that room." The sergeant obliged. Mr. Ainsworth, with a small ironical bow to Miss Marple as he passed her chair, went out, and the door of the library, at the far end of the hall, closed upon him with the discreet click of a well-kept lock. Slack, left in the drawing-room with the two women and the doctor, drew a chair close to the sofa and sat down. His face, hard-featured, professionally sceptical, had grown a shade less certain of itself, and this, Miss Marple observed, was a great compliment paid to Miss Prynne, who up to now had commanded nobody's uncertainty about anything. "Miss Prynne," said the inspector, "you understand what you have said." "I understand. You understand also that you have placed yourself by your own admission in a position of very grave accessory." "I understand. Then before you say another word I must caution you." "Inspector," said Miss Marple in her mildest voice, "might I, before you proceed, ask Miss Prynne a single small question? It has nothing to do with the events of the night before last. It has to do only with a cup of tea." Slack, who had had a good many dealings with Miss Marple's single small questions, looked at her narrowly, and then said, with the resignation of a man who has learnt that objection is more troublesome than assent, "Very well, one question." Miss Marple set down her cup, which she had all this time held quite quietly in her lap, and took up the sugar tongs. From the tea tray she selected 2 small lumps, and placed them with great care upon her saucer. Then she looked kindly across at Miss Prynne. "My dear," she said, "when Mrs. Westcott took her cordial at 10 o'clock, the little glass of eau sucrée, was it not, which she took every evening at that hour, who prepared it for her on the night before last?" Miss Prynne's colourless eyes rested upon the 2 lumps of sugar. It was quite a long look, and quite a still one. Then she said, without altering her voice, "I did." "You did?" "Yes, as you had done every night, I dare say, for the past 3 years. You measured the drops from the little brown bottle upon the dressing table into the small glass. You added the sugar. You carried it down. Yes?" "Yes. And on the night before last, my dear, did you count the drops, as you always did, or did you, without counting, pour from the little brown bottle you had that afternoon brought back with you from the White Hart at Market Basing?" There was, then, a silence in the drawing-room of Fernhollow Grange which had in it the particular quality of a great hall in which a note has just been struck and is dying. Miss Prynne did not move. Her hands remained folded, her face remained composed, but upon the back of the right hand, once more, the small blue vein began slowly to beat. "You are mistaken, Miss Marple," she said at last. "I brought back nothing from the White Hart." "Then, my dear, forgive me, for I am an old woman and my questions are always more tiresome than they need be. How did the digitalis in Mrs. Westcott's cordial come to be at 3 times its ordinary strength, when the bottle from which you poured it was, by Mr. Petherick's register, an ordinary bottle at ordinary strength, the bottle now found in the coal bunker, and when the bottle upon the writing table which was placed there afterwards to be discovered is a different bottle altogether, of thicker glass and darker label? Somebody, my dear, poured the strong stuff into the cordial glass, from a bottle which was not at that hour in this house. 2 bottles were in this house. A 3rd bottle came in, was used, and went out again. Where did that 3rd bottle come from, my dear, if not from a gentleman's pocket in Market Basing?" Miss Prynne was silent. "Answer, Miss Prynne," said Slack, very quietly, "if you can." "I have nothing," said Miss Prynne to add. Miss Marple leaned forward, and with the air of a person offering a small kindness at a difficult moment, said, "My dear, you did not pour those drops. I have never believed that you did. You are at this moment protecting somebody, but you must understand that you are protecting him from a rope, not from a scandal, not from an inconvenience, but from a rope. And you must ask yourself, my dear, very calmly, as I am sure you are able to ask yourself, whether he in your position would perform the same office for you. I think you know the answer to that question, Miss Prynne. I think you have known it since 9:15 the night before last, when he sent you home upon the last bus, alone, in the dark, wearing grey." The blue vein beat once, twice, 3 times. Miss Prynne's eyes closed. When she opened them she was, Miss Marple perceived, no longer looking at anybody in the room. She was looking at somebody very far off, at a girl of 18 perhaps, in a small hotel at Sidmouth 30 years back, at a young man of 25 with a well-shaped mouth and a habit, then already forming, of measuring the furniture. What she said, when she spoke, was strange and low and quite without emphasis. "I did not pour the drops," she said, "but I fetched the 3rd bottle. He gave it to me, at the White Hart. I brought it in my handbag. I put it upon the dressing table upstairs at 7:30 when I came home. He was to come. He came. He was 7 minutes in the room. When he came down, the bottle in my handbag was gone. I did not look to see what he had done with it. I did not wish to know." "You did not wish to know," said Miss Marple gently, "because you did know. That, my dear, is often the hardest kind of not knowing." Miss Prynne did not answer, and afterwards, said Miss Marple, at 10 o'clock, when Mrs. Wiescott rang for her cordial, you carried it up. It had already been prepared. It had been prepared, that night, not by you but by him, before he left, upon the dressing table. You had only to bring the glass and place it in her hand, and then to come down again. And then, later, in the small hours, to go up alone and take from the bureau the letter she had written earlier in the evening, and burn it in the bedroom grate, that no one might read what she had written to a solicitor in Somerset that morning, which was, if I do not mistake, a letter of instruction concerning the withdrawal of certain expectations from a certain Mr. Ainsworth of Market Basing. Miss Prynne said, still without emphasis, "I burnt it, yes, because he asked you to, because he had asked me, a great many years ago, in Torquay, to do a smaller thing, and because a person who has once done a smaller thing, Miss Marple, is not, by that person, ever afterwards permitted to refuse the larger." Dr. Haydock from the fireplace muttered something under his breath that was, from a doctor, remarkably unclinical. Inspector Slack, writing with a hand that had at last steadied to the seriousness of the case, said, "You will make a statement, Miss Prynne, at the station. Now, you understand." "I understand." She rose. She was, Miss Marple observed, no larger than she had been an hour before. She had not that habit of enlargement which comes upon some people when they at last unburden themselves. But she was, distinctly, of a different substance. She had the appearance of a woman who has, at some cost, discovered the shape of her own soul, and has found it neither better nor worse than she supposed. She walked to the door with her habitual small, precise step, and there she paused, and turned, and said, quite courteously, as one guest to another, "Miss Marple, you knew, of course. When?" "Yesterday afternoon, my dear, beneath the lime trees, when you were kind enough to tell me the truth about the letter from Somerset, and untrue about the fireplace in which it had been burnt. It was the untruth I was grateful for. It told me, you see, that you had been upstairs, and that you were therefore either the murderer or the person who had wished the murderer to succeed. I hoped all night that you would prove to be the second, and if I had proved, said Miss Prynne, to be the first, then, my dear, said Miss Marple with great gentleness, I should have been very sorry, because you are, though you have taken great pains to conceal it, a woman of quite considerable feeling, and murder, in a woman of feeling, is a much more grievous thing than in a man like Mr. Ainsworth, in whom feeling was, I think, never at any time inconveniently present." Miss Prynne regarded her a long moment, then she inclined her head, quite formally, and went out with Sergeant Lake, who had come, at Slack's signal, to fetch her. The drawing-room door closed. From the library, at the far end of the hall, there came the sound of a man walking, once, twice, across a carpet, and stopping. Miss Marple picked up her teacup. Her hand was quite steady, but the tea in it, she noticed, had grown cold. Section 9. The Woman Who Would Not Die. The tea in Miss Marple's cup had grown cold, and she set it aside upon the low table with the same small ceremony with which she had, 30 years before, set aside a great many other cups of tea at a great many other moments of finality. From the library at the end of the hall came a further sound, the low murmur of Sergeant Lake speaking, and once the drier, more cultivated murmur of Mr. Ainsworth replying, "Doctor." Haydock had gone out into the garden by the French doors and was, from the terrace, lighting his pipe with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who wishes his hands to have something to do. Slack, upon his hard chair, was going over his notes. The house, in short, had settled into the queer, suspended calm of a place in which a great matter has been decided but not yet declared, and Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, would have said, had anyone asked her, that everything was now perfectly plain, and that she was well satisfied. She would have been lying. She was thinking, instead of a small blue vein, she was thinking of a face composed, of a hand that had unfolded and refolded itself the other way about, right hand over left, as though correcting a piece upon a chessboard, of a voice that had said, "I did not pour the drops, but I fetched the third bottle," of a voice that had said, "I burnt it, yes," of a voice that had been, at every syllable, precisely as calm as it had needed to be, not calmer. There is a kind of confession, Miss Marple was reflecting, that is offered by a woman who has been broken, and there is another kind, quite different, that is offered by a woman who has, for a long time, been preparing to be broken at the correct moment. The second sort is very rare, but it does occur. It had occurred, she remembered, in the case of the second Mrs. Badger of Chipping Cleghorn, who had gone to the assizes with an air of tragic dignity, and had accepted 18 years' imprisonment with the same small, precise step with which she now, Miss Marple, raised her head, had just walked from this drawing-room. 18 years, in the case of Mrs. Badger, being a considerable improvement upon the alternative, which was a rope. "Inspector," said Miss Marple very softly, "might I detain you a moment longer?" Slack looked up. "You have," she said, "at this hour, a confession from Miss Prynne, a partial one, placing the greater guilt upon Mr. Ainsworth, and you have from Mr. Ainsworth, I dare say, a defensive silence, which will presently become a defensive volubility, placing the greater guilt upon Miss Prynne. You have 2 bottles, you have a burnt letter, you have a motor car in a lane, you have, in short, everything you could possibly wish to have, and I am afraid I must ask you not to be satisfied." "Miss Marple," said Slack, "if you are about to tell me, I am about to tell you, Inspector, that neither of them killed Mrs. Westcott." Slack sat down again with a small hard breath. Dr. Haydock, upon the terrace, ceased quite suddenly to draw upon his pipe. "Explain yourself," said Slack. "I will try," said Miss Marple, folding her hands, "though you must be patient with me, for I am not a quick thinker, and the shape of this matter has only lately begun to be plain. Do you remember, Inspector, what Ellen the maid told Mrs. Clement yesterday afternoon? That the bedroom grate held a great deal of pale ash, more than a little bit of paper would make, more than a letter would make, considerably more, enough to be, I should say, several letters. Well, Miss Prynne has confessed to burning one letter, the letter Mrs. Westcott wrote to a solicitor in Somerset, containing her instructions concerning Mr. Ainsworth. Very good. But the grate held more ash than one letter would produce. What else was burnt, Inspector? By whom? And when?" Slack frowned. He did not answer. "Now consider," said Miss Marple. "The little glass of eau sucrée. Mrs. Westcott, we are told, took this glass every night at 10, prepared for her, as Miss Prynne now says, upon that particular night by Mr. Ainsworth, at the dressing-table upstairs, before he left the house. Placed for her by Miss Prynne, at 10 o'clock, in the drawing-room. Very good. But, Inspector, why in the drawing-room? Mrs. Westcott had at 10 o'clock gone upstairs already, according to Miss Prynne's own earlier account, with the letter from Somerset, to burn it in the bedroom grate. She was upstairs at 9:30. She came down again. When? Miss Prynne does not tell us. She simply says the cordial was carried up. Or does she? She said, this morning, I noted it particularly, that the glass was brought and placed in her hand. In whose hand, and where? She looked at Slack. Slack looked back with the wooden face of an inspector who has been told he is holding the wrong end of a stick, and does not yet perceive which end that is. There is a further detail, Inspector, which I did not mention this morning because I had not at that hour understood it. When I arrived at the Grange yesterday, I observed that the tall clock in the hall had stopped at 10 minutes past 4, not a common hour, not a chime hour, not, one would suppose, an hour at which anyone in a household of this sort would happen to be attending to a clock. Yet the clock had stopped, not run down, stopped. The pendulum was steady, the weight had not descended, the mechanism had, so to say, been arrested, as though a hand had reached in and held it. You are saying somebody stopped the clock deliberately. I am saying that somebody stopped the clock deliberately at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, because at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, Inspector, Something happened in that hall which whoever stopped that clock wished us to think had happened much earlier or much later. Now which, I wonder, was it? She rose and moved to the writing table. The letter to Alice, she said, which we all took to be Mrs. Westcott's last act, the pen fallen at her feet, the ink upon her lap, began, if you recall, with the words, "My dear Alice, there is something I must tell you before it is too late," and the ink of that unfinished sentence, when I looked at it yesterday morning at 8, was quite dry. Ink upon paper, Inspector, in this warm weather, dries in perhaps 20 minutes. In a wing chair by a shut window, perhaps 30. The letter had not been written 5 minutes before Mrs. Westcott's death. It had been written some hours before. Slack's frown deepened. So the letter is not the last act. The letter is not the last act. The letter is a stage property, Inspector. It was placed there, with the pen at the feet and the little brown bottle upon the table, to compose a tableau, a woman writing to her niece a warning that came too late. But it is untrue. Mrs. Westcott did not die at her writing table before dawn. She died, I am inclined to think, at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, in the hall, and she was carried into the drawing-room and arranged, and the clock stopped upon the exact minute of her death, because whoever arranged her wished the police to be told the hour, and could not bear to tell it in words. "Why in words?" said Slack. "Because," said Miss Marple, "the person who arranged her had spent a long lifetime being unable, at the critical instant, to say a thing out loud. It was a habit, Inspector, a very deep habit." There was a silence. Dr. Haydock came in from the terrace. "Jane," said Haydock, "are you telling me that the digitalis is a blind?" "I am telling you, my dear doctor, that the digitalis is real, and that Mr. Ainsworth truly did place the strong bottle upon the dressing table, meaning to poison Mrs. Westcott through her cordial. And I am telling you also that Mrs. Westcott, at 10 o'clock, did not drink her cordial. She had been warned, and when she went upstairs, she poured it into a wash jug, or a plant, or the empty fire grate. Whichever it was, it will still be there if you look. She then wrote her letter to the solicitor in Somerset. The letter Miss Prynne burnt, and she went to bed. "She died," said Miss Marple, "at 10 minutes past 4 in the hall. She had come downstairs, I think, because she had heard something, a footstep, a door. She was a woman who investigated her own house at night. She was, in her way, a brave woman, and in the hall she met the person she had least expected to meet there, and that person, seeing her face, and seeing that she now understood, took up something to hand, the marble paperweight from the console table perhaps. There is a paperweight, and it has been moved, and struck her once, upon the side of the head. There was a very small quantity of blood, just enough, doctor, to leave upon the arm of the wing chair afterwards a dry, dark smear which you noticed and did not mention to Inspector Slack." Haydock's face was quite grey. "Yes," he said, "I noticed. I did not mention it. I thought I had been mistaken." "You were not mistaken. She was dead by 4:30. She was carried to the wing chair. The letter she had begun the evening before, the letter to Alice, which she had broken off at before it is too late, because Miss Prynne had come into the room, and she had thought better of finishing it in company. That letter was fetched from her bureau upstairs, and laid on her lap, and the pen laid at her feet. The little brown bottle from the dressing table, the strong one, was carried down and set upon the writing table, unstoppered, and the weaker bottle, from Mr. Petherick, was wrapped and thrust into the coal bunker, and then the clock was stopped, and then the fire in her bedroom was lit, and various papers were burnt in it, not only the letter to Somerset which Miss Prynne had burnt earlier, but other papers of which we shall never now know the substance. Something at any rate was got rid of. Something at any rate could not be permitted to survive her. She turned, quite gently, to Inspector Slack. "Inspector," she said, "your murderer did not leave this house at 11:30 in a motor car. Your murderer slept in this house all night. Your murderer walked, at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, out of a bedroom upon this landing, and down these stairs. And your murderer is at present, I believe, sitting at Dr. Haydock's, drinking a cup of tea, and quite unaware that Ellen the maid had a great deal to say about pale ash." Slack's mouth opened. It closed again. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "you cannot possibly mean Miss Westcott." "I mean," said Miss Marple, in her mildest voice, "the person who yesterday morning, in this drawing-room, wept in an exact rhythm, who told me last night, with dry eyes, that she was ashamed of having spoken unkindly to her aunt, and who, this morning, was called across to Dr. Haydock's upon a message which, I now perceive, Miss Prynne was very careful indeed to bring, because Miss Prynne is, if nothing else, a woman who understands that Alice, alone with me for another hour in this house, would not have survived my questions." Section 10. The victim who stayed silent alive. Inspector Slack's mouth which had opened and closed once already, remained for some seconds in the intermediate position of a man who has swallowed a fact whole and is not certain whether it will agree with him. Dr. Haydock, by the French doors, set down his pipe upon the terrace balustrade with the small deliberate care of a man whose fingers have chosen, at that moment, to be uncertain of their grip. From the library, at the far end of the hall, came a single incongruous sound. Mr. Ainsworth clearing his throat, quite composedly, as though he had heard nothing at all. "Miss Marple," said Slack, in a voice which had shed, for the first time in his professional acquaintance with her, its faint edge of grievance. "If you will be so good, from the beginning." "From the beginning, Inspector," said Miss Marple, folding her hands upon her lap, "is a great compliment, because the beginning of this affair is not last week, nor last year, nor even 3 years ago when Miss Prynne came to Fernhollow Grange. The beginning of this affair is 31 years ago, at a small hotel at Sidmouth, kept by a Mr. and Mrs. Prynne. There was, at that hotel, a young girl of 18, the Prynnes' only daughter Emily, a quiet, pale girl, already old for her age, and in that hotel one summer stayed a young lady of 19, the granddaughter of a rich clergyman in Somerset, a fair, quick-tongued girl named as Mrs. Bantry has this morning obligingly recollected Latimer. Poor, pretty, foolish Latty." Slack was writing. His pencil, no longer sceptical, moved swiftly. "And at that hotel," said Miss Marple, "there was also, for 1 week only, a young solicitor's clerk of 25, come down from Bristol, with a well-shaped mouth and a habit already forming of measuring the value of the furniture, Mr. Harold Ainsworth. He courted Miss Latimer. He courted her, I imagine, in the way he has since courted many others, with the professional attention of a man who knows precisely what a girl of 19 wishes to be told. There was, in the end, an entanglement. There was, in the end, a child. There was, in the end, a scandal covered, as such things are covered, by a hasty removal of the young lady to a house of confinement in the north of France, from which she did not return alive." She paused. Dr. Haydock upon the terrace said very quietly, "Good God! Miss Latimer died, Inspector, of an illness which was not, I think, entirely natural, and the child died also. And Miss Emily Prynne, who had been Miss Latimer's confidant, who had, in a smaller way, helped to conceal the entanglement, and had accepted from Mr. Ainsworth at that time a very modest sum for holding her tongue, became, from that summer forward, a woman with a history. She left Sidmouth. She took a companion's post in Torquay. She took another in Bath. She took another, at last, at Fernhollow Grange, and for 3 years she was the perfectly colourless Miss Prynne whom we have all known." "And Mrs. Westcott?" said Slack. "Mrs. Westcott, Inspector, was Latty's cousin." There was a silence. From the terrace, Dr. Haydock made a small, wordless sound. "Eleanor Westcott," said Miss Marple, "was in the year of the tragedy a girl of 18, and she had loved her cousin Latty. She never forgot, she never forgave, and when, one afternoon in the autumn of last year, she was going through a bundle of old letters in this room, as Alice has told me, she came upon a letter, 30 years old, from Latty, in which Latty had written of a certain summer, of a certain young man, and of a certain quiet girl at a hotel in Sidmouth. And Eleanor Westcott understood then that her paid companion of 3 years' standing was the same Miss Prynne who had held her cousin's dying hand in France. She did not dismiss her. She did not accuse her. She kept the letter, and she locked the drawer, and she was, as Alice noticed, markedly kinder to Miss Prynne from that day forward, because Eleanor Westcott had begun in her own way to plan." Slack looked up. "To plan what?" "To find the man," said Miss Marple. "To bring him within her reach, to wait for him to become, as such men become, recognizable, and, when he was recognizable, to expose him. She did not, I dare say, at first know that Mr. Ainsworth had prospered. She did not know that he was solicitor at Market Basing, but she wrote, quietly, patiently, over 8 months, to old friends of her cousin's family in Somerset, saying nothing to anyone, asking small questions, gathering small answers. She had at last, in April of this year, a letter which told her that a Mr. Ainsworth, formerly of Bristol, now practising in Market Basing, had married 2 ladies in Somerset with dowries, both of whom had died within 12 months of their weddings. And when, one afternoon in May, this same Mr. Ainsworth was brought by chance to her drawing-room upon a matter of investment, she recognised him at once, although he did not, from the height of 30 years and the arrogance of his profession, recognise her. She drew a slow, calm breath, and from that moment, Inspector, Eleanor Westcott ceased to be a widow of moderate means and immoderate correspondence, and became something quite different. She became bait. She became, quite deliberately, a foolish elderly woman who could be courted for her money. She encouraged him. She walked with him beneath the lime trees. She permitted the village to gossip. She permitted her niece to quarrel with her. She permitted Miss Prynne, who from the day Mr. Ainsworth first crossed the threshold, was in mortal terror, for she alone in the house knew who he was, to be drawn back into her old bondage. Because Mrs. Westcott, Inspector, needed all these things. She needed Mr. Ainsworth to feel safe. She needed Miss Prynne to be his accomplice. She needed her niece to be angry. She needed the whole of St. Mary Mead to be conveniently deceived, and on the evening of the 31st of May she wrote a letter to a solicitor in Somerset, not one of instruction as we have supposed, but one of denunciation, a full statement of everything she had gathered concerning the deaths of the 2 Somerset wives, to be opened and acted upon in the event of her own sudden decease. That letter Miss Prynne saw upon the hall table, and knew for what it was. That letter Miss Prynne told Mr. Ainsworth of, at the White Hart, at 7:30. That letter, Inspector, made her murder inevitable. Then Ainsworth, said Slack. Mr. Ainsworth, said Miss Marple, prepared, as we have heard, the strengthened bottle. He came, at 10:05, up the stairs. He placed the bottle. He gave Miss Prynne her instructions. He went. Mrs. Westcott, at 10 o'clock, took her cordial from Miss Prynne's own hand, and, as I told you, poured it away. She had, I now perceive, been listening at the top of the stairs, and had heard Mr. Ainsworth in her bedroom, and she had known perfectly well what he had come to do. It was the moment she had prepared for. She had at last her proof. In the morning she meant to call the police. But in the morning, said Slack slowly, she was dead. In the morning she was dead. By whose hand? Miss Marple's pale eyes rested a long moment upon the pattern of the carpet. When she spoke, her voice was of that particular gentleness which she reserved for the moments in which gentleness could no longer be avoided. By her niece's, Inspector, by Alice's. Slack said nothing. It was not on his part disbelief. It was only that his professional habit required, at such an instant, that the person named should be given the courtesy of a small pause. Alice Westcott, said Miss Marple, loved her aunt, not perhaps warmly, but truly. She had quarrelled with her that very evening, over Mr. Ainsworth, over money, over 100 small things, and she had gone to bed in tears, and unable to sleep. In the small hours she came down. She heard, as I think, a small sound in the hall. Her aunt at the foot of the stairs, perhaps, or upon the drawing-room threshold. She came out of her bedroom, and stood upon the landing, and looked down. And there, in the hall, at 4:10, she saw her aunt, quite well, quite alive, bending over the console table, upon which lay a paper. Alice came down, and her aunt, hearing her, turned, and seeing her, held out to her the paper, which was, I do not doubt, the statement she had written the evening before, and which she had brought down that hour to hide behind the loose brick of the garden wall, against the morning. Alice read a line, perhaps 2, and Alice understood, in that one moment on the flagstones of her own hall, that her aunt had for 8 months been playing a game, that the quarrels, the encouragements to Mr. Ainsworth, the coldness to Alice herself, had all been part of a design, that Alice had been used, quite lovingly, quite mercilessly, as a piece upon the board, that the aunt who last night had at last called her a good girl had not called her so at all, that the whole affection of the previous evening had been the last small preparation of a woman about to spring her trap, that Alice, in short, had been made a fool of by the only person in the world whose good opinion she had ever really wished for. She paused. Her hand lay perfectly still upon her lap. That, Inspector, is a wound which no young woman of 26, none I have known at least, can be certain of surviving, and Alice did not survive it. She took up the marble paperweight from the console table, and she struck her aunt, once, upon the temple. And Mrs. Westcott, who had died 1,000 small deaths that week to bring this hour about, at last died a real one, upon the flagstones of her own hall, at 4:10 in the morning, at the hands of the niece she had loved and betrayed. Alice then, being, as she has proved in every hour since, a young woman of remarkable coolness, went upstairs to Miss Prynne's room and woke her, and told her precisely what had happened. And Miss Prynne, in whom terror had for a fortnight been running towards a point, saw at that moment her opportunity. She had a murder ready-made, in a household in which Mr. Ainsworth had that very night attempted a murder of his own. She had only to arrange the scene so that Mr. Ainsworth should hang for it, and she and Alice would go free. And so it was done. The paperweight was washed and set back. The cordial was poured, at that late hour, into the mouth of the dead woman. The wing chair, the letter to Alice, the pen at the feet, the strengthened bottle upon the writing table, the weak bottle in the coal bunker, the stopped clock, all of these, Inspector, were Miss Prynne's compositions, at Alice's direction, in the small hours before dawn. and the bedroom fire in which the letter to Somerset was burnt, and with it that other paper, the statement from the console table, was Alice's own touch, because Alice could not bear that her aunt's last accusation should survive its writer. Ellen the maid was quite right. That fire was lit by hand, and it was not the mistress's. The silence which followed this had in it the particular quality of a bell which has ceased to ring but which still holds the room. Slack sat quite still. Dr. Haydock had closed his eyes. From the library once more came Mr. Ainsworth's small, entirely composed cough. "Miss Marple," said Slack at last, "you are certain?" "I am certain, Inspector. I regret it very much, but I am certain." He rose heavily and went out into the hall and gave a brief order to the constable who had been posted at the front door, and the constable went out into the lane and turned in the direction of Dr. Haydock's, and, some 15 minutes later, came back with a fair young woman walking quietly at his side, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes clear, wearing the shawl she had put on that morning to go across the road. She came into the drawing-room and looked once at Miss Marple and said, in a voice that was, to the very last inflection, the voice of a well-bred niece, "You have been very clever, Miss Marple. I hope you are, on the whole, pleased with yourself." "No, my dear," said Miss Marple very gently. "I am not, on the whole, pleased with myself at all." Section 11. The bell that rang at last. The fair young woman was taken away in the second police car, and Mr. Ainsworth was taken away in the first. And the constable who closed the door of Fernhollow Grange behind them did so, Miss Marple observed, with an unusual quietness, as though he had understood, without having been told, that the house had suffered enough noise for one day, and would prefer for a little while none at all. Miss Prynne had already been driven to Much Benham an hour before. There remained, in the drawing-room, only Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and the tea-tray upon which the second cup had grown cold beside the first. Dr. Haydock looked at his old friend for a long moment. Then he said, "Jane, come away. Come home." They walked, the two of them, down the drive and out at the iron gate, and along the lane between the hedges towards the village. The afternoon had, at last, the honesty to be an ordinary afternoon, warm, unhurried, smelling of cut grass and dust, the doves gossiping in the copse behind the vicarage, a boy on a bicycle wobbling past with a loaf of bread balanced upon his handlebars. From the church tower, as they crossed the green, the bell rang for evensong, 5 clear strokes, no tremor upon any of them. "It rings quite steadily this evening," said Dr. Haydock. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is because the hand that pulls the rope no longer has anything to fear." He looked at her sidelong. "You knew this morning about Alice." "I suspected yesterday. I knew this morning when Miss Prynne came into the drawing-room and told her that Dr. Haydock wished to see her. It was too neat, Doctor. It was much too neat. A message from you would have been brought by a man from the vicarage, not by Miss Prynne from the passage. Miss Prynne had been sent to fetch Alice out of the house because Alice, alone with me for another hour, would not have been able to keep her composure. Miss Prynne was, at that moment, protecting the true murderer and putting the false one in her hand's reach. It was very cleverly done, and you let her be led away. I let her be led away, Doctor, because I had not in that hour yet seen the whole of the shape. I saw the whole of it only when Miss Prynne, going through the door, turned back and asked me when I had known. It was in her question, Doctor, not in her answer. She had asked me if I knew that she had murdered her mistress. She had not asked me if I knew that she had helped to conceal it. There is a great difference, and she understood the difference perfectly. She was offering me, out of a queer late loyalty to Alice, an entire confession of a crime she had not committed, in exchange for silence about the crime that had been committed by the girl she had raised for 3 years like a daughter. Doctor, Haydock said after a long pause, that is a very terrible loyalty. It is the loyalty of a woman who has been of no importance to anybody for 30 years. Such a loyalty, when it discovers itself, is not, alas, always well placed. But it is, in its way, the truest thing about her. They walked on. Presently they came to the small gate of Miss Marple's cottage. She paused with her hand upon it, and looked back, once up the lane towards Fernhollow, whose tall chimneys showed above the limes, and it seemed to her at that moment that she saw the shape of Eleanor Westcott very clearly indeed, an upright woman of 58, with a firm, angular hand and a heart which had for 30 years harboured a single small, cold, unforgiven grief, a woman who had chosen in her last year of life to become bait for the man who had wronged her cousin, and had died, before she could complete the sentence, by the hand of the niece for whom she had, in the very act of preparing her trap, at last begun to feel something like love. The victim, Miss Marple thought, who had stayed silent alive. She had stayed silent for 8 months, while she gathered her proof. She had stayed silent on the last evening when she wrote to a solicitor in Somerset and did not tell her niece what she had done. She had stayed silent even in the hall at 4 when she held out to Alice not an accusation but a paper, and hoped perhaps in that instant to be understood. She had lived silent, and she had died silent, and the sentence she had begun to Alice, "There is something I must tell you before it is too late," had proved in the end the truest sentence any of them had spoken, because it had been too late indeed, from the moment she had first decided to keep her knowledge to herself. "There is a lesson in it," said Dr. Haydock heavily. "There is always a lesson," said Miss Marple. "The lesson in this instance is that one should not, my dear doctor, use the people one loves as pieces upon a board. However good the game, however just the end, it is not in the long run permitted." He nodded and touched her hand once, gently, and went on down the lane towards his own house, and Miss Marple went in at her own gate and up her own path between the delphiniums, and paused in the porch to shake the dust of Fern Hollow from her shoes. Griselda was waiting for her in the parlour, with a fresh pot of tea and a face full of the news which had already, by some means known only to villages, spread from the police car in the lane to every parlour, kitchen and back garden in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat down in her own chair by the window, and accepted her cup, and said nothing at all for some minutes. "Jane," said Griselda softly. "Yes, my dear." Alice, I hope, will not hang. Miss Prynne's statement and Mr. Ainsworth's will between them show, as I intend to show also, that the true intent to murder that night was Mr. Ainsworth's, and that Alice's blow, though fatal, was struck in the extremity of a shock which no jury of Englishmen will, I think, wholly disregard. She will be committed, for some years, to a place where she will have leisure to consider what her aunt did to her, and what she did to her aunt, and, if she has any goodness in her, and I believe she has, buried very deep, she will come out of it a different woman. It is the best, I think, that one can hope for her. And Miss Prynne? Miss Prynne will go to prison. She had already, in a smaller way, gone to prison 30 years ago, and she has been serving her sentence ever since in Torquay and Bath and St. Mary Mead. To be locked up now, formally, will not, I fancy, alter her circumstances very greatly. She may even, in some ways, feel that her position has been at last clarified. That, too, is a mercy of a kind. And Mr. Ainsworth, said Miss Marple, with a small unhabitual dryness, will hang. There are 2 ladies in Somerset who will be very glad to see it. So, I dare say, would Latty have been. Griselda was silent. Outside the window the delphiniums leaned a little in the evening air, and beyond them the roof of the vicarage caught the low honey-coloured light, and behind the vicarage the tower of St. Mary's stood dark against a sky beginning at last to turn. "Jane," said Griselda at last, "were you never mistaken? Not once? Not even for an hour?" Miss Marple considered her tea. "I was mistaken, my dear, for the whole of the first day. I believed the writing table. I believed the small brown bottle. I believed the interrupted letter. I believed, in fact, precisely what Alice had wished me to believe. It was only when I saw that the ink was dry, and heard about the ash in the grate, and remembered that the clock had stopped at 4 that I understood I had been looking, all this time, at a very careful arrangement, and even then I supposed, until this afternoon, that the arrangement had been Mr. Ainsworth's. It was Alice's. Alice had, as young women who have been overwhelmingly hurt so often have, a great gift for arrangement. She had been arranging her aunt's affections, and her aunt's suspicions, and her aunt's misunderstandings, for years quite skilfully. When at 4 o'clock in the morning she was called upon to arrange her aunt's body, she did what she had been doing all her life. She arranged. That is a dreadful thing to say of a girl of 26. "It is a dreadful thing, my dear," said Miss Marple, "but so are a great many things about girls of 26 that we have been kind enough, for many centuries, not to say. Alice was clever, and unloved, and had been for the whole of her adult life the second person in every room she entered. She had never learned, nobody had ever thought it worth their while to teach her, that love, when it comes very late, and comes bent into a peculiar shape by the person who offers it, is still love, and is still owed the ordinary courtesies. She struck her aunt because she believed her aunt had made a game of her. She was in that instant quite wrong. Her aunt had loved her in the awkward, cold, calculating way in which such women love, and had meant to tell her so in the morning. That is the tragedy, Griselda. The victim was silent because she was still preparing her speech. She set down her cup. "It is a very old story," she said. "It is the story of the maid at Old Hall who poisoned the parrot, and of the governess Miss Lahitimer whom I knew as a girl, and of Mrs. Badger of Chipping Cleghorn, and of a great many others whom I have known and forgotten. It is always in the end the same story. There is a person who has decided to be quiet about the thing that most needs to be said, and there is another person who cannot bear the quiet, and between them, in due course, a third person dies. It is not a story that becomes less sad by being often repeated. The church bell rang the half-hour for evensong. This time it rang neither softly nor firmly, but simply, as a bell rings when nobody in particular is thinking about it. The village at that instant was resuming itself. Mrs. Hartnell had ceased to look out of her window. The postman was going home. Mr. Petherick was closing his shop. Colonel Bantry had lit his after-dinner pipe. The equilibrium of St. Mary Mead, which had been disturbed at 8 o'clock the previous morning by a bell that rang too softly, had reassembled itself, in the way English villages have, without appearing to have noticed that anything had happened at all. Only in one small cottage, at the window between the delphiniums, an old lady with pale eyes and quite white hair sat looking out into the evening, and thought, without especially wishing to think it, of a firm, angular hand upon a sheet of writing paper, and of a sentence which had begun, "My dear Alice, there is something I must tell you before it is too late," and had never, in this world or any other, been permitted to reach its full stop. "Poor Eleanor," she said, at last, very softly. "Poor Latty, poor Alice, poor Miss Prynne." Griselda reached across and took her hand. Outside, the last stroke of the bell died over the fields, and the light in Miss Marple's parlour deepened from honey to rose, and from rose to a soft, faithful grey, in which the shapes of the ordinary things, the teapot, the folded gloves, the sheath of secateurs, the small packet of unwanted peppermints, stood as they had stood the day before, and would stand, in all likelihood, tomorrow. The end.